Imagine it's 1946. You're a retired schoolteacher in Manchester, England. You survived the Blitz. You ate powdered eggs for 6 years. You bought war bonds when the government asked because it was your duty, because Churchill's voice on the radio made sacrifice feel noble. Now the war is over, Germany is rubble, the boys are coming home, and you have those bonds, paper promises. The government owes you money. You look at the numbers. You bought bonds worth roughly 2 years of your salary. Enough, you thought, to add comfort to your final years. Maybe a small cottage by the sea. Maybe something to leave behind. But something strange is happening. The cost of bread is rising. Coal is rising. Everything is rising. Not dramatically. Not enough to cause riots. Just steadily, persistently, year after year. By 1950, the purchasing power of those bonds has already eroded by a third. By 1955, half. By 1970, what was once 2 years of salary will barely cover 2 months of living expenses. You were never defaulted on. You were never told the debt wouldn't be honored. You were simply repaid in currency that bought less and less and less. And here's the part they never teach in schools. This wasn't a failure. This wasn't mismanagement. This wasn't an accident. This was the plan. Every nation that has accumulated debt beyond its capacity to repay through growth and taxation has exactly 3 options. 1, default, refuse to pay, trigger immediate crisis, accept political destruction. 2, austerity, cut spending and raise taxes so severely that the debt can be serviced honestly, accept economic destruction. 3, inflate, repay the debt in nominal terms while quietly destroying its real value, accept the slow destruction of savers, pensioners, and anyone holding fixed income assets. Throughout modern history, every major debtor nation has chosen door number 3, not because they are evil, not because they are stupid, but because door number 3 is the only door that allows politicians to survive, economies to function, and the illusion of solvency to continue. This isn't theory, it's documented history, and it's happening right now. This video is the autopsy of a system that cannot admit what it's doing, examined through the mechanism that makes it possible: financial repression. Once you understand it, you will never look at inflation, interest rates, or government policy the same way again. When governments run deficits, most people understand the basic arithmetic. The government spends more than it collects in taxes. To cover the difference, it borrows. It issues bonds. Investors buy them. The government pays interest. Eventually, the principal comes due. This is presented as sustainable because of one assumption: the economy grows. If GDP grows faster than debt, then debt as a percentage of GDP shrinks over time. The obligation becomes manageable. The system works. This is the story taught in economics courses. This is the story told by Treasury departments. This is the story that underpins every long-term budget projection. And it's true, under certain conditions. The conditions are these: interest rates must remain below the rate of economic growth. Tax revenues must keep pace with obligations. External shocks must not disrupt the trajectory. And the political will to maintain fiscal discipline must persist across administrations, across generations, across crises. Let that sink in. That's the baseline assumption. Not that the economy performs miraculously, just that nothing goes significantly wrong for decades at a time. Now look at any century of recorded history and count how many multi-decade windows have met those criteria. The answer is almost none. What happens when the criteria aren't met? What happens when debt compounds faster than growth? What happens when interest payments consume an ever larger share of revenue? The system tells you there are contingencies. The system tells you there are adjustments. The system tells you adults are in charge. The system does not tell you about the invisible tax. Here's the mechanism in plain terms. Governments cannot default on debt denominated in their own currency. They control the currency. They can always print more. The legal obligation is nominal. Pay back the number on the paper, not real. There's no legal requirement to pay back purchasing power. If a government borrows $1 trillion today and must repay it in 30 years, it needs only ensure that $1 trillion exists in 30 years. What that $1 trillion buys is not the government's legal concern. This distinction, nominal versus real, is the foundation of the escape plan. Inflation erodes the real value of debt. If inflation runs at 6% annually, the real value of a fixed debt halves in about 12 years. At 8%, it halves in 9 years. At 10%, it halves in 7. The bondholder gets repaid. The number on the check matches the number on the bond. No default has occurred. No law has been broken. And yet, wealth has been transferred. Quietly, invisibly, legally. From savers to borrowers. From creditors to debtors. From those who held paper promises to those who issued them. The largest debtor in any modern economy is the government itself. You begin to see the incentive structure. The term financial repression was coined by economists Edward Shaw and Ronald McKinnon in 1973. They were studying developing economies. But the mechanism they identified was not unique to the developing world. Financial repression is a set of policies that allow governments to borrow at below-market interest rates, effectively forcing savings into government debt at rates that do not compensate for inflation. The tools vary. The effect is consistent. Tool 1, caps on interest rates. Governments either explicitly or implicitly suppress the rates banks can offer depositors. Your savings account pays 2% while inflation runs at 7%. The difference, that 5% annually, is a transfer from you to the borrower. Tool 2, captive domestic audiences. Pension funds, insurance companies, and banks are required by regulation to hold a percentage of their assets in government bonds. This creates demand for government debt that is not voluntary. It is mandated. The buyer has no choice but to accept whatever yield the government offers. Tool 3, capital controls. When savers try to move money abroad to find better returns, governments restrict the flow. Your wealth is trapped inside a system designed to devalue it. Tool 4, central bank accommodation. The central bank purchases government bonds, pushing prices up and yields down. This suppresses the interest rate the government pays. The mechanism is indirect but powerful. The central bank creates money to buy debt that would otherwise require higher yields to attract buyers. Tool 5, inflation itself. Sustained inflation that exceeds the interest rate on government debt creates a negative real return for bondholders. They are paying the government for the privilege of lending to it. None of these policies are labeled debt reduction through stealth. None of them appear in budget documents as transfer from savers to government. They are described in technical language: macroprudential regulation, quantitative easing, monetary accommodation, financial stability measures. The terminology obscures the function. The function is transferring real wealth from private creditors to public debtors. Return to 1945. The Second World War left the major combatants with debt loads previously unimaginable. The United States emerged with federal debt at 119% of GDP. Britain's debt exceeded 250% of GDP. These were not sustainable by any conventional measure. The interest payments alone would have consumed most of government revenue. Default was unthinkable. These were the victors. These were the architects of the post-war order. Their currencies would underpin Bretton Woods. Their bonds were held by their own citizens, who had sacrificed for the war effort. Austerity at the scale required was politically impossible. You cannot tell populations that survived rationing and bombing that they must now endure decades of poverty to repay their own sacrifices. That left door number 3. What followed was the most successful implementation of financial repression in modern history. In the United States, the Federal Reserve pegged interest rates on government bonds below 2.5%. This wasn't a market rate. It was an administered rate. The Fed bought whatever bonds necessary to maintain it. Meanwhile, inflation ran between 5% and 15% through the late 1940s. Real interest rates were deeply negative. Bondholders were losing purchasing power every year, but the numbers on their statements looked fine. The payments arrived on time. The system appeared solvent. By 1955, U.S. debt to GDP had dropped to 57%. By 1974, it was 32%. The government did not run surpluses to achieve this. It did not grow its way out through miraculous productivity gains. It inflated. The real value of the debt melted. The nominal obligation remained. The difference was paid by everyone who held dollars or dollar-denominated assets. Economists Carmen Reinhart and M. Belen Sprancia studied this period in detail. Their research, published in 2011, calculated that financial repression saved the U.S. government between 2% and 3% of GDP annually in reduced debt servicing costs through the post-war decades. That's the equivalent of an annual tax, unlegislated and visible, on anyone holding financial assets. Britain did the same. So did France. So did every major debtor nation that emerged from the war. This is where it breaks. No one called it a tax. No one voted on it. No finance minister stood in Parliament and announced that savers would pay for the war through the gradual erosion of their purchasing power. It simply happened. Quietly, persistently, over decades. And it worked. The post-war financial repression succeeded because conditions were uniquely favorable. First, capital controls were the norm. The Bretton Woods system restricted international capital flows. Money could not easily flee. If you were an American saver earning 2% while inflation ran at 8%, you could not move your savings to Switzerland without navigating regulatory barriers. Your wealth was captive. Second, alternative assets were limited. The stock market was still viewed with suspicion after the 1929 crash. Real estate markets were local and illiquid. Commodities were for specialists. Most middle-class wealth sat in bank accounts and government bonds. There was nowhere else for it to go. Third, wage growth was robust. Inflation eroded savings, but wages rose in tandem. Workers, at least organized workers in industrial economies, saw real income gains. The pain was felt by retirees and passive investors more than active workers. The political coalition that might oppose inflation was weak relative to the coalition that benefited. Fourth, Debt was domestically held. American war bonds were owned by American citizens. British war bonds were owned by British subjects. The wealth transfer was internal, from one group of citizens to another, mediated by the government. There was no external creditor with the leverage to demand real repayment. Fifth, trust was high. Governments had just won a world war. Institutions were credible. Central banks were seen as competent. The public did not yet understand financial repression as a deliberate policy. They experienced rising prices as a feature of post-war adjustment, not a mechanism of debt reduction. These conditions allowed the greatest debt reduction in modern history without default, without declared austerity, and without political crisis. Think about what that means. The mechanism was so effective that it became the template. Here's the pattern. When debt becomes unsustainable, default is catastrophic. Austerity is politically impossible. Inflation becomes the path of least resistance. But inflation cannot be announced. The moment a government declares it will inflate away its debts, creditors flee. Bond yields spike. The debt becomes more expensive to service, not less. The mechanism only works if it's deniable. Central banks must always claim they are targeting low, stable inflation. They must always claim the current inflation is transitory. They must always claim the bond purchases are about market functioning, not debt monetization. The language matters. The framing matters. Because the mechanism requires that creditors continue lending while their claims are slowly devalued. If creditors understood what was happening, truly understood, they would demand inflation-adjusted yields. They would require real compensation for real risk. The government's borrowing costs would rise. The trap would close. But creditors have short memories. They have mandates that require them to hold government bonds regardless of yield. They have analysts who are trained in the same institutions that produce the policies. They have models that assume central banks will always act responsibly. And so the lending continues. And so the devaluation continues. And so the transfer continues. There is no conspiracy here. There doesn't need to be. The incentives are sufficient. Politicians benefit from borrowing cheaply today. Central bankers benefit from being seen as accommodative during crises. Financial institutions benefit from the stability of the system continuing. Regulators benefit from the absence of visible defaults. The only losers are diffuse: savers, pensioners, future generations, anyone holding fixed income assets. Their losses are slow, cumulative, and hard to trace to a specific policy decision. By the time the erosion is visible, it's attributed to the economy or global conditions or market forces, never to policy, never to choice. That's the trap. The template adapts to local conditions. Weimar Germany, 1921, 1923. Hyperinflation. Debt destroyed completely in real terms, but so was the currency, so was the economy, so was the political order. Too much inflation, too fast. The mechanism failed because it was not controlled. The public understood what was happening before the debt was extinguished. The result was societal collapse. This is the cautionary tale. Inflation works as a debt reduction tool only if it's slow enough to be unnoticed, fast enough to be effective, and stable enough to not destroy the underlying economy. Post-war United States and Britain controlled financial repression. Inflation ran higher than interest rates for decades. Capital controls prevented flight. Wages rose with prices. The middle class did not feel robbed because their incomes kept pace. Only those living on fixed incomes, retirees, bondholders, paid the hidden tax. Latin America, 1980s, 1990s. Repeated cycles of debt, inflation, and currency crisis. Argentina, Brazil, Mexico. Debt denominated in foreign currencies, dollars primarily, meant inflation couldn't erode the real obligation. Devaluation just made the dollar debt larger in local terms. The mechanism failed because the debt wasn't in the debtor's own currency. External creditors demanded real payment. Japan, 1990s present. Enormous debt, over 260% of GDP, but almost entirely domestically held. Interest rates near zero for decades. Inflation mostly absent until recently. The mechanism is muted because inflation hasn't cooperated. Japan has delayed the reckoning through extreme monetary policy, but has not yet executed the standard debt reduction playbook. Eurozone, 2010-2015. Greece, Portugal, Ireland, Spain. Debt in euros, but no ability to print euros. No national currency to devalue. The mechanism was unavailable. The result? Severe austerity, economic depression, political crisis. The absence of the escape valve, the inflation option, meant the full cost fell on populations directly. Each case teaches the same lesson. Debt in your own currency can be inflated away. Debt in someone else's currency cannot. This is why reserve currency status matters so much. This is why the dollar's role in global finance is defended with such intensity. The privilege isn't just convenience, it's the ability to borrow in a currency you control and repay in a currency you define. Now examine the present. United States federal debt, over 120% of GDP, higher than the post-war peak. Interest payments on that debt. approaching $1 trillion annually, the fastest growing category of federal spending. Federal Reserve policy, interest rates raised from near 0 to over 5% in 2 years. But inflation-adjusted rates remained near 0 or negative through much of 2022 and 2023. Real rates are only recently positive. Ownership of U.S. debt still substantially domestic. Foreign holdings, while large in absolute terms, are declining as a share of total debt. The marginal buyer is increasingly the Federal Reserve and domestic institutions. Regulatory requirements. Banks, pension funds, and insurance companies are required to hold safe assets, which by regulation means government bonds. The captive audience exists. It is mandated by law. Inflation trajectory. After spiking in 2021, 2023, now moderating. But even moderate inflation, 3%, 4%, at rates below government borrowing costs, produces negative real returns for bondholders. The configuration is not identical to 1945. Capital flows are freer. Alternatives like cryptocurrency, gold, and foreign markets are accessible. The public is more financially literate, or at least more suspicious. But the fundamental structure is the same. The government has debt it cannot realistically repay through growth and taxation. Default is unthinkable. Austerity is politically impossible. The remaining option is the one that has been chosen every time before. The language will deny it. The policy will pursue it. The cost of financial repression is not evenly distributed. It falls heaviest on those who hold nominal assets and lack pricing power. Retirees living on fixed pensions. Their income is set. Their expenses rise. The gap is the transfer. Savers holding bank deposits. Interest rates below inflation mean their purchasing power shrinks annually. A 3% savings rate with 5% inflation is a 2% annual loss. Compounded over a decade, that's nearly 20% of real wealth erased. Bondholders and pension funds. The future income stream they were promised will buy less than projected. The shortfall will eventually manifest as reduced benefits, increased contributions, or both. Middle-class holders of fixed income portfolios. The safe portion of a retirement account, the bonds, becomes the mechanism of loss. The safety is nominal, not real. Those who benefit are debtors, homeowners with fixed-rate mortgages. The mortgage balance stays constant while income and home prices rise. The real burden of debt falls. Corporations with fixed-rate borrowing. The same arithmetic applies. And the largest debtor of all, the government. Every percentage point of inflation above interest rates transfers wealth from bondholders to the Treasury. Unlegislated, invisible, legal. The political economy is clear. Debtors vote. Savers, especially elderly savers, are politically passive. The coalition that benefits from inflation is larger, younger, and more politically active than the coalition that loses. This is why the escape plan is chosen. Not because policymakers are malicious, but because the political economy makes it the path of least resistance. There's a point at which the math becomes inescapable. When interest payments on debt consume a significant share of government revenue, the fiscal space for discretionary action disappears. Every dollar spent on interest is a dollar not spent on services, infrastructure, or defense. When debt to GDP ratios are high enough, even small increases in interest rates produce large increases in debt servicing costs. The budget becomes hostage to Federal Reserve policy. When the marginal buyer of debt becomes the central bank itself, because foreign buyers are reducing exposure and domestic markets require higher yields, the line between monetary and fiscal policy dissolves. This is monetization, regardless of what it's called. At this point, there are only three options. 1. Allow interest rates to rise to market clearing levels. Accept the fiscal crisis that results when interest payments crowd out all other spending. 2. Default. Declare the debt unsustainable and restructure it. Accept the collapse of the dollar-denominated financial system. 3. Suppress rates below inflation through whatever mechanisms are necessary. Accept the slow transfer of wealth from creditors to debtors. None of them are painless. Options 1 and 2 are politically unsurvivable. No administration will choose explicit default or fiscal collapse. Option 3 is the only one that allows the system to continue functioning while the adjustment occurs. The constraint isn't ideological, it's mathematical. Debt compounds, interest compounds. Growth is variable. The arithmetic eventually forces a resolution. The question is never whether the resolution occurs, it's how the cost is distributed. The mechanism requires deniability to function. The moment a Treasury Secretary announces, "We intend to inflate our way out of this debt," the bond market response is immediate. Yields spike. The cost of new borrowing rises. The existing debt becomes more expensive to roll over. The very statement of intent defeats the intent. Central bankers must maintain the fiction that their only goal is price stability. They must point to their mandates. They must insist that any inflation is transitory, temporary, due to supply shocks or external factors, never to deliberate policy. Politicians must claim they are fighting inflation even as they pass legislation that increases it. They must denounce high prices while supporting the fiscal and monetary conditions that produce them. The cognitive dissonance is a feature, not a bug. If the public understood that their savings were being taxed, not through legislation, but through devaluation, the political response would be severe. If retirees understood their fixed incomes were a deliberate sacrifice to fiscal solvency, they would vote accordingly. But the mechanism is diffuse. The cause and effect are separated by time. The connection between policy and outcome is obscured by layers of technical jargon. Inflation is blamed on greedy corporations, foreign adversaries, supply chains, oil prices, anything but the expansion of money and credit that made it possible. The policy succeeds precisely because it cannot be named. Step back. Every major debtor nation that has accumulated obligations beyond its capacity to honestly repay has followed the same sequence. Phase 1. Accumulation. Debt rises during crisis, war, pandemic, recession. The borrowing is justified as temporary. The promise is always, we will grow out of this. Phase 2. Normalization. Debt levels that would have been unthinkable become the new baseline. Projections are revised, definitions are changed, the goalpost moves. Phase 3. Rate suppression. Central banks keep interest rates below the natural market rate. The justification is economic stimulus, full employment, financial stability, never debt management. But the effect is debt management. Phase 4. Inflation. Prices rise. Wages follow with a lag. The real value of debt erodes. The nominal obligation remains unchanged. The transfer occurs. Phase 5. Denial. Officials insist inflation is under control, temporary, caused by external factors. The policy is never described as financial repression. The mechanism continues. Phase 6. Resolution. After a decade or two, debt to GDP has normalized. The adjustment is attributed to growth, responsible policy, good management. The role of inflation is minimized or ignored in official histories. This sequence has played out in the 1940s and 1950s. It played out in the 1970s. It is playing out now. The details differ. The structure is identical. The current debt load of the United States and most developed nations cannot be resolved through growth and taxation alone. This is not opinion. This is arithmetic. Nominal GDP would need to grow at rates far exceeding historical averages, sustained over decades with no recession, no crisis, no war. Interest rates would need to remain below growth rates indefinitely. Political will would need to maintain fiscal discipline through every electoral cycle. None of these conditions are realistic. The alternative is the escape plan. Inflation running above interest rates, real wealth transferring from creditors to the government. Slow, quiet, persistent. This is already happening. The question is not whether the mechanism is in motion. It's how long it continues, how high inflation runs, and how much wealth is transferred before equilibrium is restored. Historical precedent suggests the process takes 10 to 20 years. It requires sustained negative real interest rates. It requires public acceptance or ignorance of what is occurring. It requires the narrative to focus on anything but the actual mechanism. There are truths that cannot be spoken in official settings. Central banks cannot admit they are subordinating inflation targets to fiscal stability. Treasury departments cannot admit they are relying on inflation to manage debt. Politicians cannot admit that the fight against inflation is largely theater, while the conditions for inflation are deliberately maintained. Financial advisors cannot tell clients that the safe part of their portfolio is the mechanism of wealth transfer. Pension funds cannot tell beneficiaries that projected returns assume conditions that would erode the real value of their benefits. The system runs on unspoken understandings. Insiders know the mechanism. They adjust their own portfolios accordingly. They hold real assets, property, equity, commodities, that rise with inflation. They minimize exposure to fixed income instruments that bear the cost. Outsiders, the general public, small savers, those without financial sophistication, hold the assets that lose. This is not conspiracy. It's information asymmetry. It's the predictable outcome of a system where the mechanism cannot be publicly acknowledged. What should an individual do with this understanding? This channel does not give investment advice. That would be irresponsible and illegal. But understanding the mechanism suggests certain questions worth asking. What assets maintain value during periods of financial repression? Historically, real estate, equities, commodities, inflation-linked securities, assets with pricing power, assets whose value is tied to real economic output rather than nominal promises. What assets lose value? Fixed income instruments, cash savings, long-term bonds at fixed rates, anything that pays a return denominated in nominal currency while that currency is being debased. What strategies did sophisticated actors use during past periods of financial repression? They borrowed at fixed rates to acquire real assets. They minimized holdings of government bonds. They sought exposure to economies outside the repression zone. What does debt mean in this context? Personal debt at fixed rates, mortgages primarily, behaves like government debt. Inflation erodes the real burden. The monthly payment stays the same while incomes rise. These are not recommendations. They are patterns from history. What worked in the past may not work in the future. Conditions change. Policies change. The mechanisms adapt. But the fundamental dynamic, that inflation transfers wealth from creditors to debtors, does not change. It is mathematical. The debt escape plan doesn't conclude with a specific event. There is no announcement, no declaration of victory, no admission of what occurred. One day, the debt to GDP ratio is back to normal levels. Historians will attribute it to growth, to responsible policy, to good fortune. The role of inflation will be a footnote, if mentioned at all. Those who held nominal assets through the adjustment will be poorer in real terms. Their losses will be invisible in the statistics, because the statistics are nominal. Their standard of living will have eroded slowly enough that it feels like natural aging, not policy. Those who held real assets will be wealthier. Their gains will be attributed to investment skill, market timing, or luck. The connection to monetary policy will be unstated. The transfer will be complete. And then, a generation later, the borrowing will begin again. The debts will accumulate. The same promises will be made, that growth will solve it, that fiscal discipline will prevail, that the adults are in charge. And when the debts become unsustainable, the same three doors will present themselves. And the same door will be chosen, because it is always chosen. Because it is the only door that allows the system to continue. This video examined financial repression, the debt escape plan governments never admit using. It is not a prediction of what will happen. It is a documentation of what has always happened. The mechanism is historical. The pattern is documented. The arithmetic is inescapable. When debts become too large to repay honestly, they are repaid dishonestly. Not through fraud, not through default, through the quiet devaluation of the currency in which they are denominated. The bondholder receives payment, the number matches, the obligation is met, and the wealth is gone. This is historical and educational analysis. It is not financial or investment advice. Consult qualified professionals before making financial decisions based on any information presented here. The pattern is already in motion. History doesn't repeat, but it rhymes. The only question is whether you hear the rhyme before the verse ends. This channel exists to study the autopsies before they repeat. If this lens was useful, subscribe. Most people never see these patterns until the transfer is complete.